everyone. My name is Jorge Marturano. I am Associate Professor of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the Chair of the Program on Caribbean Studies at UCLA, that is part of the Latin American Institute. For me, it's a pleasure to present this event, that the main topic is the relationship between the United States and the Venezuelan crisis. We are not doing too many events in the last few years on Venezuela, but I think it's fundamental to bring again the topic in the current situation of the change of government by the new elections and so on. So we will have a group of scholars to will discuss how do they see the situation with and the appropriate role of the United States in resolving the current situation in Venezuela, and if there is really a position that the United States has to weigh in. So let me introduce very fast the name of the panelists, and then the assistant director of the Latin American Institute, Brian Pitts, will introduce each of the speakers. Thank you very much, and welcome to Paola de Alemán from Formación Acción, Diego Arias from the Atlantic Council, Timothy McGill from the University of Tennessee, and Antonio González Plechman, Collective Sargents. Colectivos Urgentes. This event is being co-sponsored by the Latin American Institute and the Program on Caribbean Studies. Thank you very much.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. My name is Brian Pitts, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Latin American Institute here at the University of California, Los Angeles. I am really excited about this event today. Although I am not a scholar of Venezuela myself, although that may be an advantage when discussing Venezuela these days, because I think that one thing that makes me so excited about this is that the political situation in Venezuela has been polarized for a very long time. And it's often difficult to have conversations that look towards solutions in Venezuela because sometimes it seems to me as an outsider, the two sides shout past each other. And that's something we very much see in the United States right now as well. And so sort of in keeping with the theme that's very important to me and to the Latin American Institute, we want to think about studying Latin America, not in terms of what we as Americans can offer to Latin America, but also in terms of what Latin America can offer to us. And so I would hope that not only for people in the United States who are deeply concerned about the situation in Venezuela and about the future of the country would be interested in this, but also Americans who are concerned with political polarization in our country. Because the panel we put together today really stands out because of the fact that whatever the political perspective of the individual participants might be, the body of their work all really highlights that they have a commitment to dialogue and that they realize that you can disagree with people, but in the end, you have to live in the same society and you have to come up with common ground or at least understand each other. And so, that is one thing I'm really excited about, just plus the fact that as someone who studies Latin America, the situation in Venezuela is, I think, something that's of concern to all of us who love Latin America and Venezuela. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Professor Timothy Gill. He's Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. His book, Encountering U.S. Empire in Socialist Venezuela, The Legacy of Race, Neocolonialism, and Democracy Promotion, will be published in 2021 by the University of Pittsburgh Press. He also edited the volume, The Future of U.S. Empire in the Americas, the Trump Administration and Beyond, which was published this year by Routledge. He has also written op-eds for a variety of media outlets, including The Washington Post, The Nation, and Jacobin, and he earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Georgia. So, Tim, take us away. Got to unmute you. There we go.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Let me just pull this up. I wasn't sure if you were going to introduce all of us or just me. So, yeah, thank you so much, Brian, Jorge, and the panelists. Thanks to everyone for being here. If you're in academia, I know it's kind of a wild time and of course out in the broader world, but perhaps there's an end in sight. So Brian asked me to talk about my own work on U.S. democracy assistance in Venezuela. This is what my dissertation and forthcoming book are about, as Brian noted. So I'm going to say a few words about that. A little background, just as Brian just noted as well. I completed my dissertation in sociology at the University of Georgia in 2016. In doing so, I traveled to Venezuela several times to interview folks working at human rights and political non-governmental organizations, NGOs, as well as folks working for the US government in the country. I also conducted interviews in Washington, D.C., and over the phone with folks who formerly worked on issues of U.S. foreign policy in Venezuela, former ambassadors, folks at the Department of State, folks at the National Endowment for Democracy and its associated groups like the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and so on. This isn't going to be an academic talk, but I just want to make a quick notes out of the way of where this comes from. I'm not going to get into any jargon or theory or anything like that. I also sent out some Freedom of Information Act requests for documents from the Department of State, from the National Endowment for Democracy and the U.S. Agency for International Development, documents detailing U.S. efforts in the country under the Chavez government. And also in my work have examined diplomatic cables coming out of the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, laying out U.S. foreign policy activities in the country. These groups, the NED and its associated groups, USAID, Department of State, ostensibly aimed to support democracy in Venezuela and elsewhere in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and beyond, by funding programs and activities of NGOs, political parties, and social movements. Elsewhere, some of these groups work directly with legislatures and governments, all in an effort to promote democracy writ large. There's an interesting history here involving the development of the National Endowment for Democracy in the early 80s and the involvement of US aid in the promotion of in political development. USAID was established in the 1960s for economic development, the Alliance for Progress, things like this. But in the 1980s and 1990s into the present, gets into democracy promotion. I'm not going to get into all of that and the origins and the actors, but suffice it is to say that the U.S. has not been a consistent supporter of democratic movements since really the inception of the country. And in recent decades, particularly during the Cold War, although this extends into the present, but certainly during the Cold War in Latin America, in its support for anti-communist authoritarian governments. Through these groups, the NED and USAID, the US moved more consistently promote democracy. But in recent years, many of them have lost their credibility, I would say, in many locations, have been kicked out. Their activities have been restricted, I think due to their obvious partisan nature, due to their meddling in some instances, and due to their regime change efforts. So I just want to advance a few claims about US foreign policy and democracy assistance in Venezuela during the years of the Chavez government. I should also say, I don't think all the work that's done by the NED and its associated groups and by USAID and its offices are necessarily nefarious, or that all the actors that are supported by these groups are bad faith actors that aren't interested in political rights and in human rights. I don't think it's necessarily wrong for governments to help human rights organizations abroad, groups that are truly interested in in human rights. However, in the case of Venezuela, I think these groups have indeed worked to undermine the Chavez government, certainly the Maduro government, and they've really tarnished the reputation, I think, of the US, and I think into the president's ability to really play a prominent role in any sort of negotiations or dialogue between the government and the opposition. Chavez had every right to become suspicious of U.S. funding in the country. And Maduro has every right to be suspicious, certainly, of the Biden administration with his ties to the Obama administration. Of course, Maduro, as well as Guaido, congratulated Biden, and every time there's been a election in the U.S., you know, Chavez and Maduro have wished for better relations, but there is certainly rightfully some suspicion there. Okay, so getting more specific. So in interviews, documents, and diplomatic cables, U.S. government functionaries, I think, display really an intense form of paternalism when it comes to Venezuelan citizens and the decisions that they've made, particularly in their selection of Chavistas and members of the PSUV as politicians in the country. In interviews and in documents that I collected, folks from the National Endowment for Democracy and from USAID and former high-ranking diplomats would tell me that it was their duty to show Venezuelans their true political interests, to bring, quote, Jeffersonian democracy to Venezuelans, a reference to Thomas Jefferson, the early US leader, to help cultivate a, quote, conventional Western-style democracy, in general, to help Venezuelans understand that they shouldn't be supporting Hugo Chavez. I think this sort of thinking is very similar to episodes past, US imperial episodes past in Latin America and elsewhere, wherein the US wanted to civilize and train citizens abroad to make the correct political decisions, denying them much agency and viewing Venezuelans as one high-ranking diplomat wrote, a, quote, frenzied mass. Another wrote of Venezuelans as, quote, deeply confused, and as a result, in need of US tutelage to alleviate this sort of confusion and show them who they might support. In documents, interviews, Chavez is often described as, quote, bizarre, quote, hot-headed, quote, a megalomaniac, and, quote, rambling. One National Security Council member from the Bush administration told me, quote, I remember joking with people. No one could figure out Hugo Chavez, whether he was dangerous or a clown. And then they realized he was a dangerous clown. There was never really any attempt. There's uniformly in conversations negative portrayals of Chavez and ulterior motives, never really an attempt to understand him and his appeal and the appeal of his policies. It's really just a presentation of him being as a sort of hot-headed Latin American who manipulates people. And indeed, I would ask folks that work at USAID, high-ranking diplomats, former ambassadors, why they thought Chavez believed in socialism, why he supported the sort of nationalist, resource nationalist policies that he did. And high-ranking diplomats would tell me things like Venezuela has a deficient culture. They said, you know, one opined to me that perhaps it wasn't Chavez's fault that he had these views, because Venezuela was so distorted politically for so long and didn't have a real democracy that he was sort of the product of this deficient culture. That perhaps it was machismo, one opined to me, the allegedly hypermasculine qualities of Latin American men. And that perhaps Chavez even played the race card, that he manipulated ideas about racial and ethnic inequality that didn't actually exist in Venezuela in order so he could attain power. One high-ranking diplomat told me, quote, you know how Latin America works. He comes from a less elite Indian family. He excels in the military, becomes a paratrooper. For whatever reason, he becomes outraged about the state of politics in Venezuela, which is not bad and corrupt. He believes the darker you are, the less you matter to the state. Is this a Martin Luther King or a Benito Juarez, a guy who loves liberty? Or is this a guy that says this would be a great vehicle to ride? This is a guy like others that wanted power. So once again, there's never really an attempt to understand why Venezuelans supported Chavez, instead viewing him and support for him as somewhat abnormal, anti-Western, and irrational, and once again, justifying US intervention and US tutelage. Okay, so with these ideas in mind, US government agencies sought to turn the Venezuelan population against Chavez and his allies and to support the Venezuelan opposition political parties, Primera Justicia, Democratic Action, and others, I'm sure, that some of you might be familiar with, groups that were opposing Chavez and his allies in elections. The International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, these are two groups associated with the National Endowment for Democracy, since near the initial election of Hugo Chavez, worked with opposition parties who are trying to unseat Chavez and his allies in elections. You know, and oftentimes these groups would say, we're just interested in democracy writ large. We're not interested in supporting any one group of actors. But in an interview with one representative from IRI, he told me that the purpose of these programs was, quote, to help the opposition to get their shit together so they could defeat Chavez. So people that were working on the ground for these groups in the country outside of these public relations knew quite well what their objective was in the country from the beginning, since the late 1990s until Chavez's death. These groups ran seminars for parties like Primero Justicia, Acción Democrática, COPE, how to build party platforms, how to speak to journalists, how to unify and run one candidate elections. They would host mock debates for candidates. They would help parties build websites. In recent years, the NDI, for example, has helped opposition parties to use computer software to reach citizens online, using, for instance, Facebook and sort of ICT's, information and communication technology, to reach out to voters and this sort of a thing. Okay. What about USAID? USAID has done a lot of subcontracting, much like we've seen in Cuba with Creative Associates in Venezuela. Before USAID and its Office for Transition Initiatives was kicked out of the country, before they closed down their office, there was an investigation in 2010. What were they up to? So USAID actually helped to create essentially US-run and operated community groups or NGOs in poor neighborhoods to try to convince poor Venezuelans to turn against Chavez and to support the opposition. One person who was involved with these programs in the country told me that we, quote, developed new NGOs that were looking very neutral in the eyes of the Chavez government. They looked very neutral because they had no affiliation with no political party. They were people from the neighborhood, even though they were opposition. They create the organizations with no past relation to political parties. So when they work in the poor neighborhoods, they looked very neutral. So we gave them money. They were pulling people away from Chavez in a subtle manner. We were telling them what democracy is and showing them what democracy means. We developed very nice materials and took care of every word to give them so it didn't look like we were sympathizing with the opposition. We wanted to spread liberal democratic values, not what the government said. So USAID, in summation, it developed all these materials, helped, opposition-run community groups get off the ground and make it look like it was this sort of grassroots this sort of grassroots movement. Not to say that there aren't, folks that support the opposition all throughout the country during the times of Chavez, all throughout this period. But this was a very, US-run sort of endeavor. They helped create concerts in the neighborhood and in neighborhoods and this type of thing. It's interesting, I didn't mention, there's another group associated with, I talk a bit about this in my book, is Center for International Private Enterprise, which is associated with the National Endowment for Democracy and the U.S. Chambers of Commerce. And they had a program as well in 2011, 2012, late 2000s, where they sought to target and would say quite clearly in their documents, poor Venezuelans with nothing more than a high school level of education, and they would team up with universities to try to provide them with ideological tools to push back against socialism, essentially have courses on the pros, if you will, for lack of a better word, of having a free market economy. So all this ideological activity going on that the U.S. is supporting, in some instances running. USAID also provided seminars to students who were protesting in the streets during the late 2000s, this period of college students where Juan Guaido and others cut their teeth, many big names with young names in the opposition today, and provided them with materials to distribute their ideas, paper, machines, computers, linked up with them after they started protesting, particularly Chavez's closure of failure to renew the license of a television station. One of the individuals that worked on this project told me, quote, the objective was that you had thousands of youth, high school and college kids that were horrified of this Indian-looking guy in power, Chavez. They were idealistic. We wanted to help them build civic organization so that they could mobilize and organize. This is different than protesting. So they wanted to help this group of individuals, and they did help them. Not to say it was all because of the US, but they were there to assist in any way they could these individuals to have to create organizations that persisted after the protests were over, right? So altogether, I think you find a concerted effort to undermine the Chavez government from the very beginning from the U.S. I mean, there are all sorts of questions about the coup and whether the U.S. was involved. I mean, and that's, you know, to say nothing of all of that. As a result, I do think the U.S. reputation is quite sullied in the country, and perhaps rightfully so. The idea that the U.S. just supports democracy is not true. It supports particular actors, even some actors that did participate in the 2002 coup and supported it even thereafter. And, you know, the U.S. put out the Office of the Inspector General said that quite clearly in its report that Department of Defense, National Endowment for Democracy, et cetera, had worked with groups. Maybe didn't fund them to engage in undemocratic actions, but still funded them thereafter. And so forth. They promote a particular vision of democracy, liberal democracy. They're very clear about that. Some folks would talk about John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, much different than the sorts of individuals that people in the, you know, that influence the Chavez government, be it Gramsci or Marx or Rousseau or whomever. And I think many individuals still possess a rather imperialist and at times racist view of Venezuelans and Venezuelan leaders and the role of the U.S. in the country. So I'm not very optimistic about the role that the U.S. might play in negotiations or dialogue. I think they've been a detriment to them over the last few years, and particularly with Trump. We saw some advances with Tom Shannon at the end. Was at the end or the beginning, maybe the end or the beginning, he overlapped in the two administrations before leaving during Trump. Anyway, I don't think the Maduro government is simply going to listen to Trump or Biden or Rubio to leave power. And it probably has a role to play behind the scenes, but as a prominent actor in negotiations dialogue, I don't think that the U.S., that's the U.S.'s place at this point. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim. Now we're going to move on to Antonio González Plesman, y voy a leer su introducción en español y también él va a presentar en español. Entonces, Antonio González Plesman es sociólogo, egresado de la Universidad Central de Venezuela y magíster en Derechos Humanos y Políticas Públicas de la Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar en Quito. Es militante de organizaciones populares y de derechos humanos desde la década de 80. Actualmente es codirector de Surgentes, colectivo de derechos humanos. Fue vicerrector de la Universidad Nacional Experimental de la Seguridad y ha sido consultor de diversos organismos públicos en temas de análisis político y derechos humanos. Es autor de los libros Las estrategias de la impunidad, 9 años de lucha por la justicia en el amparo, y Marco teórico metodológico de derecho a la vida, y coautor de Izquierda y construcción de políticas de seguridad, manual para alcaldías y gobernaciones. Y va a hablar con nosotros sobre sobre los efectos de las sanciones o medidas coercitivas impuestas por Estados Unidos sobre Venezuela. Entonces, Antonio, sea bienvenido.
Gracias. Brian, ¿tú puedes compartir la presentación?
Sí, claro, solamente avíseme cuándo debo avanzar. Y
vale.
Un ratito, déjeme compartir mi pantalla. Pero ya puedes comenzar, la voy a abrir ahorita mismo.
Vale, bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación a participar. A mí me gustaría arrancar haciendo unas precisiones iniciales, ¿no? En primer lugar, más que hablar de sanciones, consideramos que lo correcto es hablar, esa presentación es otra, la que está en pantalla. Continúo. Precisar que más que hablar de sanciones hablamos de medidas coercitivas unilaterales, porque el poder sancionatorio supone una legalidad y una legitimidad. A lo interno de los estados, digamos, el aparato penal tiene poder de sancionar en la medida en que lo establecen las leyes y que los ciudadanos que incluso se someten a ese poder de sancionar cuando se declaran contrarios a la ley, pues se someten al poder de sancionar en el marco de una legislación que está previamente establecida. En el contexto internacional, el sistema de Naciones Unidas, existe el poder sancionatorio por el Consejo de Seguridad, también en el marco de una legislación internacional que los estados aceptan voluntariamente el pertenecer a Naciones Unidas. Pero las sanciones que establece, que ejecuta Estados Unidos sobre Venezuela, Estados Unidos entre otros países, pero fundamentalmente Estados Unidos sobre Venezuela, son sanciones solo reguladas en su derecho interno. Con lo cual, de cara a la relación internacional, son acciones de fuerza por fuera de la legalidad internacional, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, si quieres avanza, Brian, por favor, la siguiente página. En ese sentido, hablamos de medidas coercitivas internacionales, coercitivas unilaterales, que además es el modo en que se llama en el sistema de derechos humanos de Naciones Unidas, ¿no? En segundo lugar, otra precisión inicial tiene que ver con la intencionalidad de estas medidas. Estados Unidos presenta estas medidas como favorables a los derechos, a la recuperación de la democracia en Venezuela y favorables a los derechos humanos de la población venezolana, ¿no? Esto en una rápida mirada se cae, si uno hace una mirada contextualizada, en la medida en que las alianzas de los Estados Unidos, para hablar no de la historia remota, sino muy reciente en América Latina, implican alianzas fuertes con países, gobiernos, regímenes cuyo carácter democrático es bastante dudoso, ¿no? Caso el gobierno boliviano que acaba de cesar en funciones, que llegó producto de un golpe de Estado, caso el liderazgo de Bolsonaro, caso el liderazgo de Iván Duque en Colombia, que aunque llegó, por supuesto, a través de un proceso electoral, pues su gestión en el campo de los derechos humanos es bastante cuestionable. Y por no hablar de más allá de nuestro continente, ¿no? Un aliado fundamental de los Estados Unidos como Arabia Saudita, el tema de derechos humanos y democracia, digamos, no empaña la relación. Entonces, si la intencionalidad de los Estados Unidos no tiene que ver en relación con Venezuela y la aplicación de estas medidas con los derechos humanos y la democracia, la explicación que nos damos tiene que ver con dos cosas. Por una parte, la disputa interpotencias con China y con Rusia por el control de los recursos naturales en Venezuela. Antes de la llegada de el chavismo al poder en el 98, la tradición de la política exterior venezolana era de alianza con los Estados Unidos. Y los Estados Unidos controlaban de manera directa o indirecta a partir de aliados locales los recursos naturales venezolanos, en particular el petróleo, pero no solo el petróleo. Venezuela, además del petróleo, tiene hierro, tiene minerales raros, tiene biodiversidad, tiene agua, en una posición geoestratégica muy importante para los Estados Unidos. Entonces, entendemos que parte de las orientadas a un cambio de régimen político tiene que ver con el control de los recursos naturales y la disputa de los Estados Unidos con otras potencias internacionales, en particular Rusia y China. Y también tiene que ver con la necesidad de los Estados Unidos de aleccionar a los países díscolos, ¿no? El discurso y los programas de gobierno del chavismo han sido explícitamente críticos del capitalismo, abiertamente críticos del neoliberalismo, abiertamente críticos de la hegemonía de los Estados Unidos en el mundo. Así que mostrar el fracaso de Venezuela, el fracaso del intento por construir una sociedad democrática alternativa al capitalismo en Venezuela, es también una manera de hacer propaganda o entrar en la disputa hegemónica sobre los modelos mundiales, ¿no? Un gobierno que fue importante en el giro a la izquierda de América Latina, en la construcción de alianzas que le restaron poder a Estados Unidos en la región. El fracaso de ese gobierno tiene mucho de propaganda y mucho de disputa política simbólica, ¿no? Entonces el cambio de régimen se muestra como un mensaje a otros países en el sentido de miren lo que le pasó a estos que desafiaron el poder de los Estados Unidos y el poder del mercado. Entonces, desde esas dos precisiones iniciales, entendemos las medidas coercitivas unilaterales, ¿no? Siguiente lámina, por favor. Hay una precisión más, y es que tiene que ver con el impacto de las medidas en la población venezolana. Estas medidas no son medidas contra la élite política gobernante, son medidas contra todo un pueblo, ¿no? Aunque hay en las más de 50 medidas, hay medidas individualizadas, el grueso de las medidas o las que tienen efecto deleterio son medidas que afectan la capacidad de compra, de venta, de producción del país. Entonces, su impacto no llega solamente a la élite política, sino a la mayoría de la población, a la que está a favor del gobierno y a la que está en contra del gobierno, y en particular a los sectores populares. Y quizás por eso son tan rechazadas. Esto que pongo aquí es una encuesta de una encuestadora prestigiosa de la oposición, que se llama Data Analysis, señala que el 64,1% de las personas rechaza las sanciones, ¿no? Una parte de ellos, el 35,4%, porque creen que no tiene ningún efecto en lo que va a pasar en el país. Y otra parte, el 27%, porque cree que las sanciones ayudan a aferrar más a la presidencia de Nicolás Maduro. Pero en todo caso, la inmensa mayoría de la población, 64%, se declara explícitamente contraria a las sanciones, apenas un 18,6% avalan las sanciones, que ni siquiera representan a la totalidad de la oposición, sino quizás al sector más radical de la oposición. Avanzamos, por favor. Con respecto a las sanciones económicas, el 86,7% considera que afectan al pueblo. Es decir, el 51,1% considera que afectan al gobierno, pero también al pueblo, y el 35,6% que afectan al pueblo fundamentalmente, ¿no? Entonces, las sanciones no tienen un respaldo muy minoritario en la población venezolana. Estos datos son de marzo de 2020, y repito, de una encuestadora de oposición, que son insospechablemente chavistas estos datos, ¿no? Reflejan la opinión de las mayorías del país en relación con las medidas coercitivas unilaterales. Siguiente página. Bueno, ahora sí hablando sobre el impacto de las medidas, ¿no? En Venezuela está claro que hay una caotización de la economía y una caotización de la vida, eso ya no está en discusión. Puede haber discusión si eso se llama crisis humanitaria, emergencia, pero en lo que todo el mundo está de acuerdo es que la vida está caotizada y que la principal explicación de eso tiene que ver con la caotización de la economía. Y cuando se discute por qué, el debate se quiebra, ¿no? Los sectores de oposición vinculan este caos económico a la corrupción de la élite chavista y a la mala política económica entendida como estatismo, ¿no? Esa es la explicación de la oposición. Y el lado del gobierno, pues se responsabiliza de este caos de la vida y del caos de la economía al bloqueo de los Estados Unidos y a la conspiración de la derecha local. Siguiente página. Es muy difícil hacer un ejercicio de asignación porcentual de responsabilidades, ¿no? Pero está claro que hay factores estructurales y hay factores coyunturales en este caos de la economía, ¿no? En términos estructurales, lo que está pasando hay que leerlo en el contexto de una economía rentista, una economía petrolera, que ha vivido históricamente ciclos, y que esos ciclos de caída de los ingresos han estado relacionados con caída de gobiernos, con debilitamiento de gobiernos o con caída de regímenes, ¿no? Eso no es una cosa nueva, ¿sí? Es importante meterlo en contexto. Estamos viendo una caída de la producción petrolera, que es un elemento coyuntural, pero que se enmarca en una economía rentista, que su estabilidad política ha estado relacionada históricamente con esos ciclos. Entonces, eso es un elemento estructural. Como es un elemento estructural la corrupción de la clase política. La clase política chavista se ha envilecido y se ha corrompido, eso es un hecho indiscutible, como la clase política del Pacto de Conciliación de Élites que privó entre el 58 y el 98 se corrompió y se envileció en los últimos 20 años de ese régimen. Esos elementos estructurales están ahí y explican el caos actual, o al menos hay que tenerlos en el contexto. Otros son elementos coyunturales, uno de ellos es la caída de los precios del petróleo un 60% entre 2003 y 2005 en el mercado internacional. la ausencia de una política económica explícita entre 2013 y 2015, el chavismo en el poder entró en una especie, con la muerte de Chávez, entró en una especie de letargo que implicaba, vuelve a la lámina anterior por favor, una especie de letargo que le impidió tener una política coherente, ni siquiera una política ni de izquierda ni siquiera de derecha, como es la política económica que en este momento estaría impulsando, ¿no? Y un tercer elemento coyuntural de mucha importancia son las medidas coercitivas, ¿no? En particular a partir de 2017, aunque hay que decir que antes de las sanciones explícitas había unas sanciones no dichas, ¿sí? Había ya un bloqueo financiero contra Venezuela en la medida que el riesgo país de Venezuela era inexplicablemente mucho más alto que otros países y se encarecía su capacidad de préstamo. En relación con esto, es importante decir que la política económica estatista, señalar a la política económica estatista como responsable de la crisis es, a mi juicio, poco serio en la medida en que entre 2003 y 2013 esa política, de inspiración más keynesiana que marxista, diría yo, y vino acompañada de crecimiento económico, de redistribución de riqueza y de mejora de los indicadores sociales. Así que, digamos, no es el estatismo lo que nos trajo hasta aquí. Ahora, si vemos las más de 50 medidas coercitivas, el impacto que tienen actualmente es que nos impiden vender. Vender productos en el exterior, un país que el 95% de sus ingresos en divisa provienen de la venta del petróleo y tiene en este momento la venta obstaculizada, ¿sí? Nos impide comprar productos en el exterior. Un país que depende de la importación de insumos y medios para la producción, que depende de cerca de un 50% de la importación de alimentos y más de un 50% de la importación de medicina. Nos impide acceder a préstamos en el mercado financiero occidental. Y además hay confiscación de bienes y dinero de la República. Es muy claro que esto tiene un efecto demoledor y de colapso de la vida. Si hacemos el símil en una familia, ¿no? Es como que los ingresos del padre o de la madre de la familia se reduzcan en más del 95%, que además no puedas pedir prestado y que además no puedas salir a comprar. Es decir, que sobreviva esa familia es prácticamente un milagro. Y además ese contexto obliga al Estado, evidentemente, a entrar por lo que llamamos en Venezuela los caminos verdes o las vías oscuras para maniobrar, ¿no? Así que el efecto de las medidas en el caos actual de la economía y de la vida del país es innegable. Ahora, ¿qué porcentaje tiene ese efecto y qué porcentaje tiene los errores económicos o la corrupción de la clase política chavista? Eso es muy difícil de precisar. Lo que es imposible de negar es que, sobre todo a partir de 2017, las medidas, si había una crisis, las medidas llegaron y pusieron una bomba en la crisis. La siguiente lámina. Hay casos documentados sobre el modo en que las medidas han impedido comprar medicamentos o alimentos en el mercado internacional, ¿no? Cómo bancas comerciales se han abstenido, se han negado a hacer pagos en concreto para la compra de alimentos o para la compra de medicamentos, que serían una manera de mostrar el impacto de las medidas o las consecuencias de las medidas. Pero la situación social en Venezuela es tan dramática que hay unos datos más bien gruesos que permiten hablar del colapso de la economía venezolana, que son muy expresivos. Entonces, más que en lo chiquito, creo que tiene sentido mostrar algunos indicadores. También usando como fuente organizaciones o instituciones de oposición. La siguiente lámina, por favor. Según Lencovi, que es la encuesta de condiciones de vida que realizan las principales universidades públicas y privadas del país, controladas por la oposición política. La más reciente en COVID, presentada este año, habla de un 96% de pobreza por ingresos. La pobreza implica una violación estructural de derechos humanos, porque la pobreza evidentemente limita las posibilidades de acceso al grueso de los derechos sociales. Y este proceso de empobrecimiento asociado a la caída radical de los ingresos, en Venezuela el salario mínimo es menor a $2, ahorita hay un proceso de aumento en curso, no permiten cubrir ni de cerca la canasta alimentaria y mucho menos la canasta básica. Así que el proceso de empobrecimiento ha sido masivo. Siguiente lámina. En relación con la alimentación, también según datos del ENCOVI, el 74% de los hogares tienen un grado de inseguridad alimentaria entre moderada y severa. Decía antes que el no poder comprar alimentos en el exterior es un problema para acceder a alimentos comprados por empresas privadas aquí, pero también para acceder a los alimentos que los programas alimentarios que impulsa el gobierno y que han sido celebrados por la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Alimentación y la Agricultura, la posibilidad de comprar alimentos en el exterior se ve bloqueada, ¿no? Eso es un problema muy grave y tiene que ver con esto, tiene que ver con la caída de la capacidad de consumo de la población, pero también los riesgos que tiene, las imposibilidades que tiene el Estado de comprar productos en el exterior. Siguiente lámina. La migración que se está dando en Venezuela, particularmente a partir de 2016-2017, es una migración que nosotros consideramos que es mayoritariamente forzada. Es decir, la gente no migra porque tiene aspiraciones de vivir en otro país y conocer otro país. La gente migra porque tiene hambre, tiene unas carencias económicas muy profundas y se ve obligada a migrar. Esa es la realidad a partir de 2016-2017. La migración previa era una migración de sectores de ingresos medios y altos, era una migración que podía tener motivaciones políticas o aspiracionales, pero esa no es la migración que ocurre en el país a partir de 2016. Entonces nosotros consideramos que se trata que esa migración, el grueso de esa migración que es de sectores populares, hay que leerla como migración forzada. Siguiente lámina. También, según datos del ENCOVI, el 82,8% se va porque va a buscar trabajo. Buscar trabajo es otra manera de llamar buscar medios de vida porque en el país ya no se consigue. Siguiente lámina. Bueno, eso, digamos, son unos indicadores. Ahora, ¿todo eso es culpa de las medidas coercitivas unilaterales? No. Pero a partir de 2017, sin duda alguna, tiene una responsabilidad muy grande esas medidas. Tiene una responsabilidad muy grande la decisión de los Estados Unidos. Una decisión tomada con el objetivo de producir un cambio de gobierno, un cambio de régimen político, un cambio en la gestión de los recursos naturales y un cambio simbólico político en la región. Es una responsabilidad gruesa, digamos, de los Estados Unidos. Ahora, pensando en términos de salidas, está claro que nuestra catástrofe social necesita cierta estabilización y recuperación económica. Y también está claro que para la recuperación económica necesita unas condiciones mínimas de convivencia política. En Venezuela hay lo que podemos llamar un empate catastrófico. Ninguno de los actores políticos puede aplastar al otro. El gobierno no termina de caer pese a las sanciones de los Estados Unidos y pese a los momentos de movilización importante que ha tenido la oposición, pero tampoco logra gobernar de manera consistente con su programa de gobierno y tampoco logra la desaparición de la oposición. ¿Sí? Así que ninguno logra ganarle al otro, aunque el gobierno gobierne o tenga el control del aparato institucionales, no gobierna plenamente porque no gobierna de manera consistente con su programa. Y el otro actor no desaparece. Así que lo único que cabe en este país de cara al futuro y de cara a minorar los efectos de la caotización de la economía es el diálogo y la negociación, ¿no? Que nos evite por un lado la guerra y la disminución y la reducción o la eliminación de los dramas humanos que estamos viviendo. Ahora, no es cualquier negociación la que se impone, es una negociación que tiene que implicar el derecho a la autodeterminación del pueblo venezolano, esto es sin injerencias internacionales de ningún tipo. Es una negociación que debe tener protagonismo popular, es decir, es el pueblo venezolano quien debe decidir en procesos democráticos con plenas garantías, como había sido la tradición en Venezuela hasta 2017, ¿no? Un sistema electoral fuerte y con un régimen electoral que garantizaba la plena expresión de la voluntad popular, y en el marco de la legalidad constitucional que en este momento está siendo radicalmente vulnerada por todos los actores en juego político. Es decir, tenemos Guaidó, es un presidente que se autoproclamó y que los Estados Unidos avaló, y eso ocurre por fuera del marco constitucional, y el presidente Maduro gobierna con una Asamblea Nacional Constituyente que está por fuera del marco constitucional y que le permite el ejercicio de poderes plenos y en un estado de excepción decretado de manera reiterada por varios años. Así que aquí todos los actores están jugando por fuera de la Constitución, nadie se salva. Volver a reinstitucionalizar al país, a reconstitucionalizar el país, implica, entre otras cosas, el respeto al derecho a la autodeterminación del pueblo venezolano por parte de los Estados Unidos y su política exterior, y en consecuencia la eliminación de las sanciones. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Antonio. Ahora vamos a pasar a la próxima ponente, Paula de Alemán. Paula es una política intelectual venezolana. Se graduó de periodista en la Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. Seguidamente cursó estudios de maestría en ciencia política en la Universidad Simón Bolívar. Y en 2019 obtuvo el título de doctor Rerum Politicarum en la Universidad de Rostock, en Alemania. Es presidente del Instituto Formación y Acción, miembro de la Junta de Dirección Nacional de Primero Justicia y preside la Fundación Juan Germán Rocío. Autora de A callar que llegó la revolución y editora del libro Autocracia del siglo XXI, Caso Venezuela, y también es directora de la revista Democratización y columnista de Diálogo Político. Sea bienvenida, Paula, y I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. And my best regards to Antonio, Professor Gil, Brian, Diego, and Professor Marturano, who is online, I think. And greetings from Caracas. I live here in Caracas. I came back from my PhD. And it's been a while since I don't share my ideas in English. So I ask for your tolerance. And well, I will speak in English and I will read my thoughts. And I will gladly answer to your questions and, well, to share our opinions on what's happening in our country. I would like to begin thanking to those who made possible this event, Brian, Professor Marturano, and everyone who is online right now. It's important to think and talk about the deep crisis that we are going through in Venezuela. I will divide my intervention in three parts. First, the autocratic nature of the Chavista Revolution. Second, what I think is our main challenge today, maintaining the pre-democratic conditions within the country. And third, some ideas about the relationship of the United States and the maintaining of pre-democratic conditions in our country. So my first opinions are about the autocratic nature of the Chavista Revolution. It's important to study the autocratic nature of the Chavista Revolution for two reasons. First, there is a relationship between the non-democratic type and the gender of political change that can be achieved. That's an idea that Samuel Huntington wrote in 1991. And second, the devastation caused in Venezuela is related with the autocratic nature of the system. Then, this effort to know this relationship, far from responding to a mere intellectual curiosity, is a necessary and very highly demanding political task. The Chavista Revolution is right now a non-democratic system that has developed its own features. In Autocracia del siglo XXI, Caso Venezuela, a book that I edited and published a few months ago, and you can find it in Amazon. We developed each of them, and I will briefly summarize them. The autocracy that has been installed in Venezuela is configured as follows. First, gradualness. The Chavista Revolution took over in 1999. His main electoral promise in 1998 was the dismantling of representative democracy by a national constituent assembly that wasn't allowed by the 1961 constitution. Maybe Antonio can talk about it. From that moment on, his autocratic advance has been stable and gradual. for more than 2 decades. The second feature is resilience. The gradual expansion of the Chavista Revolution shows that it's a system capable of earning autocratic learning from each crisis that overcomes. Third, ideology. The Chavista Revolution defines itself as leftist and promoter of socialism of 21st century. The authors who have studied this topic have written about the relationship between Marxist rhetoric, its existential dimension, and its capacity for real implementation. This intellectual and political concern do not detract from the ideological component of the system. Third, autocratic solidarity. The Chavista Revolution had built deep bonds from the main autocracies of the world, Cuba, China, Turkey, Iran, and North Korea. This support allows to overcome personal and economic sanctions. Then, gangster state. The Chavista Revolution gradually dismantled the democratic state that was inaugurated in 1958. This process created institutional weakness and led to the creation of criminal networks from the state, all with the intentions to remain on power in a non-democratic way. It is what I have called a gangster state in an entropic nature. This configuration has resulted in a collapsed state. That's the humanitarian crisis that we are going through. Military component. The support of the armed forces is a key element for this analysis, the analysis that I'm sharing with you. The Chavista Revolution is supported by bayonets. However, and still recognizing the weight of the military variable, I must clarify that it is not a traditional military dictatorship as we may know as Chile in the 70s or Argentina in the last century. Repressive system. The report of the United Nations Fact Verification Mission published in September 2020 revealed that the systematic nature of the violation of human rights in Venezuela. They are not isolated events. This is very important. They are not isolated events or particular initiative of specific officials. This is really, really important for us who live in Venezuela. It is a structure from the high government with the purpose of limiting our rights. These 7 components that I just shared with you, gradualness, resilience, ideology, autocratic solidarity, gangster state, military component, and repressive system, make up a totalitarian environment where the conscience of Venezuelans is sought to be dominated and our human condition is deeply affected. This reality affected us, at least in 2 ways. First, and this is something that Mr. Antonio have shared with us in the last intervention. First, economic and social effects. We are having a really rough time right now. And second, human effects. What Dagoberto Valdés, a Cuban thinker, a very important Cuban thinker, and I highly recommend to search it, Dagoberto Valdés, calls anthropological damage, daño anthropological damage. And other scholars refers as pre-democratic conditions. Now I'm going to the second part of my intervention, and I will share with you what I think it's our main challenge right now, maintaining pre-democratic condition within the country, here in Caracas, in Venezuela, in the whole country. Pre-democratic conditions are the elements in social, economical, and political life that facilitates and allows democratic development in a country. Samuel Huntington and other scholars, American scholars, and political thinkers have written about it. A few months ago, in the crisis of Belarus, the Nobel Prize Svetlana Alexievich explained that in her country, there was enthusiasm and courage, all the mobilizations that we saw in the TV and the international press. But internal forces there in Belarus were not enough because they had little capacity to organize themselves. Venezuela, my country, is not Belarus. We had 4 years of democracy, and that is in our political DNA. However, the Chavista dictatorship can already be classified, and that's a really important issue, can already be classified as long-lived, and little by little, it has eroded our culture. That is why I think that our main challenge must be to maintain the democratic condition associated with our social organization capacity, especially political parties. And why political parties? Our political culture is associated with political parties. Political parties, and this is a very important historical issue. Political parties were the first organizations that represented and articulated Venezuelan society in the 20th century. Even our unions are related to the political parties. In other words, we do not know how to organize ourselves in other way, even though there is an extended civil society who are people who work really hard and are really important to our democratic struggle, even though it's really extended. These organizations doesn't have the operational capacity, the mobilization capacity that we need for a democratic struggle. Now I will go to my third point, some ideas about the United States and pre-democratic conditions. Due the analysis that I have shared with you, the autocratic nature about the Chavista Revolution, and what I think that is our main challenge, I must say that this analysis is not just an academic or an abstract analysis. It becomes from my work here in the country. I would like to propose 4 ideas related to the United States and our crisis. First, the priority, and I think that here at the end of 2020 and beginning the next year, it's really important to think about this. The priority must be to strengthen internal civic forces. The center of the democratic struggle must remain inside the country. We must avoid a Cuban scenario where there was a dismantling of the internal forces and important resources were directed to this exile. We must join forces between the exile and the internal forces, privileging those who remain inside the country. Second, to support political parties. As I said before, we have a strong political party tradition in our democratic DNA. We must keep that. To do so, we need political education, parties, institutions, political organization, and social work. In the short term, we must recover our right to vote. This is really important. We must recover our right to vote. It's so basic. It's a political right that is really basic. Recover our right to vote and be the masters of our destiny. Third, the support of civil society. After 2 decades of Chavismo, we still have a large numbers of NGOs, and this is great news. These organizations contribute to the democratic struggle, but as Alexandra Alexievich in Belarus said, they are not capable to lead it. They are atomized and they don't have clear political intentions. Besides, it's usual to find a lot of tension between NGOs and political parties. The NGOs think that political parties maybe are corrupt and they don't have what we need to achieve freedom. And political parties knows that NGOs are incapable to articulate forces. We must find ways to work together without any tensions. And fourth, we hope that the United States will continue to lead the democratic forces that seek to limit the autocratic powers of the world that operate in Venezuela. These are turbulent times, and you all know it. The liberal and representative democracy is in crisis. Populism tends to grow worldwide. Sometimes I think that we Venezuelans talk from the future. Our crisis, the Venezuelan crisis, is part of a bigger crisis. The world needs a democratic coalition to face this threat with the strengthening of our values, the Western values. United States have special responsibilities on that task. Very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was, I think it's really great. That's what we're looking for, is a variety of political perspectives on this. And so I think there are a lot of points of discussion and of agreement and disagreement that we can have between all of our speakers who we've had so far. I'm going to go to our fourth and final speaker before we have a brief time of Q&A at the end. That is Diego Area. Diego is an associate director in the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center, where he leads the Venezuelan portfolio. He joined the Atlantic Council in December 2018 after working as a researcher at the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. Before being forced to leave Venezuela, Diego was director of social development in the municipality of Sucre, where he oversaw a team of 300 employees. Additionally, he served as campaign manager in the 2015 parliamentary elections in the state of Miranda in Venezuela, holding a similar role to in more than 10 electoral and advocacy campaigns. Diego is a graduate candidate in political management in George Washington University and earned a bachelor's degree in political science in the Universidad Central de Venezuela. So Diego, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for joining today. As you mentioned, Brian, I think that this is, we don't have enough of these conversations around Venezuela. I think that we have to promote more and more diverse dialogues among people who think differently, because this is a global challenge and we need to keep working on that. Today I am, as instructed, I will try to talk not too much about the past, but try to think about the future and how the future looks like for the U.S.-Venezuela relations under a Biden-Harris administration. I am going to start by saying that I do think that the U.S. policy towards Latin America will have a modification, will change, will evolve with a Biden-Harris administration, and they have been promising greater regional cooperation, stronger partnerships, and higher levels of U.S. investments, and a return to the principles of multilateralism. And we have been hearing that in all the campaign promises, and I think the former vice president brings deep experience and a strong commitment to Latin America and the Caribbean. having visited the region 16 times during his time in the Obama administration, more than any other vice president in US history. And in the face of the global COVID-19 pandemic, President-elect Biden will work closely with allies and multilateral institutions, in my view, to help alleviate the devastating tolls of viruses spreading in the region and the impact of the complex humanitarian crisis that Venezuela is living, but that is having strong consequences in the region. Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and countries in the Caribbean are receiving thousands of Venezuelans every day. I do think that Venezuela will remain as a priority of U.S. Foreign policy, but I do think that President-elect Joe Biden will try to recalibrate the U.S. Maximum pressure U.S. policy towards Venezuela, led by the Trump administration, and I do think, and we have heard from different speeches and the Biden team, a review of these maximum pressure policy, including U.S. sanctions toward Venezuela, to try to avoid the consequences, the humanitarian consequences of the crisis. That being said, I will try to categorize the pillars that I think are going to be the most important and have been shared with the public opinion as the priorities for the Biden-Harris administration, starting by the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis. President-elect Biden will seek to alleviate Venezuela's humanitarian crisis by leading international efforts to provide development assistance into Venezuela, as well as mobilizing resources to migrant host countries such as Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean as well. Currently, the U.S. has already provided more than $1 billion in life-saving aid to Venezuela, and I think we can expect the Biden administration to continue and expand this trend. In addition, Vice President Harris, in a meeting with constituents in Florida, said that their administration will focus on providing aid to humanitarian organizations that are supporting Venezuelan refugees, which also translates to financial support to countries in the region who have dealt with the brunt of these migratory crisis. It's important to mention that not only migration has been hitting the democratic stability of the region, the sanctions, and this is the second theme that I would like to talk about. Of course, we cannot say that sanctions hasn't have a deep impact in the economic situation in Venezuela, but I do think that the main challenge that sanctions have created is the evolution of the Maduro regime into a more criminal enterprise, is the promotion of international partnership with nefarious actors and non-state irregular actors that, to circumvent U.S. sanctions and the Western financial system, have created a criminal network, and that have forced the Maduro regime to partner with these irregular actors to seek a lifeline and to maintain power. That, in my view, is the ultimate goal of the regime right now. In terms of Venezuela sanctions, let's remember that during the Obama-Biden administration, Biden was a vocal supporter of promoting security and democracy through the hemisphere. I do think that President-elect Biden will likely recalibrate the sanctions policy towards Venezuela in coordination with U.S. allies, including, of course, the European Union, to ease the humanitarian impact of sanctions and try to leverage them as a tool for international diplomacy. One of the main, in the past attempt of negotiation in Oslo and Norway, one of the main challenges of the conversation of the parts was the ease of sanctions per the U.S. administration part. And I do think that, speaking in a more informal way, President Donald Trump did the dirty work for the Biden administration. And right now, I do think that there is hope for a different solution. I think that the maximum pressure policy is common knowledge that didn't have the expected results, but these sanctions that need to be recalibrated and rethink because they didn't have the impact expected are a tool right now and not an objective, a tool to try to promote transactions, and I do think that these transactions that led to an electoral outcome needs to be centered within the humanitarian alleviation of the suffering of the Venezuelans inside Venezuela. This is not an easy task. You have heard from 3 and now 4 different people, profiles, and actors from the academia, etc., with different perspectives, and this translates into the U.S. government, between and among agencies. This also happens within the international community with different visions about what is the best solution, what should be the silver bullet or the best solution for the Venezuela crisis. So I do think that, and I want to reiterate, Brian, that spaces like these, not only in the academia, but also promoting these conversations among international actors is very important for the future of Venezuela. That will not end, the crisis will not end with regime change. The institutional consequences in Venezuela, the hyperpolarization, the erosion of democratic principles, the presence of irregular groups in Venezuela that are controlling vast territories is going to be a huge challenge, not only for Venezuelans, but for Venezuelan neighbors to stabilize the country after a negotiation takes place in the country. Then, of course, we listened to Professor Gill talking about the U.S. role in Venezuela in the past, and we also listened from Antonio. And of course, all of this happens in the midst of great power competition. We can label Venezuela as a subsidiary battle for great power competition with actors, not only the US, but actors such as Cuba, such as a deep involvement of Russia and China, etc. So I will take the 10 minutes that I still have to talk a little bit about that. In terms of, and to think about what could happen and what could be a Biden-Harris administration approach to this multidimensional challenge. So around China, multilateral coordination, strategic investments, and strong partnerships based on democratic values will allow President Biden to better position the US rather than China and their Belt and Road Initiative as the partner of choice for countries in the region. This will require, of course, sustained long-term engagement with the region, especially in Venezuela. China provides important financial and diplomatic support to the Maduro regime, and only from 2007 to 2017, Beijing provided more than 60 billion in financing to Venezuela, representing more than 40% of total Chinese lending in Latin America. This is not a minor number, and it will seek to play an important role in Venezuela's eventual reconstruction, regardless of who is in power. China has also involvement in intelligence schemes that have been leading to social control in Venezuela. So they are a key player in this equation of great power competition. Then we go to Russia, and President Putin has not congratulated President-elect Biden. And while this only will, in my view, exacerbate the tensions between the two countries, the incoming U.S. administration is likely to prioritize prioritize transatlantic ties between US and Europe, and renew the United States commitment to NATO and countering Russian power, not only in Latin America, but in Europe and globally. Historically, President-elect Biden has had a tough stance on Russia. For instance, he pushed for sanctions in response to the 2014 Ukrainian crisis. We can expect more stringent enforcement of existing measures and new sanctions on Russia, especially given Russian involvement in propping up the Maduro regime. And we cannot talk about Russia without, and Venezuela without talking about Rosneft and the sanctions on Rosneft. I think that in my perspective, those sanctions will stay in place, continuing to diminish Russia's presence in Venezuela's oil sector. It will be, in my view, interesting to see how this translates into incoming administration reacting to Russia providing arms and other military equipment of Venezuela. And when we talk about Russia and Venezuela, we also have to talk about disinformation efforts and to promotion of narratives, not only in Venezuela, but in the region, and leveraging the structure, the political structure of the Maduro regime to promote narratives through the region. And part of my job is to identify, expose and explain disinformation in the region. And we have seen the increased presence of traditional media channels such as Russia Today and Sputnik, with an increased presence in the region, promoting anti-US narratives, and also we have seen a trend that promoting distrust in the democratic process across Latin America. So again, this is not a local and national issue and challenge. This is part of the great power competition. We have foreign forces playing important roles in the future of Venezuela, and I think that when thinking about a resolution, a political resolution first, minimum concessions for each part. I agree with Antonio's statement, and I'm going to say it in English and in Spanish. I'm sorry. No hay recuperación económica sin mínimas condiciones de convivencia política. I agree with that statement, but I would add to that I don't think that there will be a political resolution without involving all the international powers that are involved currently in Venezuela. Now I will close my conversation. My time is running, but of course we have to talk and we have to think about Cuba in this equation, and the approach of the U.S. new administration towards Cuba. I want to talk a little bit of that before going to open questions that I don't have the answer to, but I think that it will be interesting to listen the perspective of the other speakers. But President-elect Biden has called for a new Cuba policy that will reverse Trump's tightened restrictions on U.S. travel and remittances to Cuba, as well as sanctions shipments of Venezuela oil to the island. So questions here. Maybe, just maybe, could the U.S., the new administration, reframe the relationship with Cuba and try to promote a more constructive relation with Venezuela, and use Cuba as a bridge of communication with Venezuela, as happened with the Colombian peace process, Cuba playing an important role in the process. Would the Venezuela issue be a priority in the next administration? And can we see Venezuela being used as an exchange token for other interests, maybe Ukraine or in other areas of the world? I think it's all to be seen, but lastly, I don't see we will see a radical change in US policy in the near term, because this administration will have to face all the challenges of these transition, new and different and challenging and polarized transition within the U.S. and all what that takes into account, and also replacing the bureaucracy of the U.S. foreign policy to start changing the way the U.S. Relates to international partners. So I will leave it at that and open to questions and comments on that.
And before we, I will go ahead and select some of the questions that have been submitted via the Q&A. Before I do that, I did want to acknowledge and welcome Professor Kevin Terracciano, who is the director of the Latin American Institute. He had a prior engagement that ran a little bit late, so he wasn't able to be with us at the beginning of the presentation, but he's going to close us out after the Q&A. So we have about 10 minutes left for Q&A. If we go a couple of minutes over past 1:30 Pacific time, that's okay. We don't want to keep people here too long, although of course you're free to leave whenever you want. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and we have several questions. I'm going to try to focus on ones that actually ask a question rather than make an ideological point, which I know can be kind of hard to distinguish sometimes. But we have several questions from, tenemos varias preguntas de Alejandro Conejero, que se puso durante la presentación de Antonio. Entonces, esa pregunta será principalmente para Antonio, pero los otros ponentes pueden participar también. Y Alejandro hizo 3 preguntas, entonces voy a elegir una para comenzar. Y digo que, entonces, parece que Alejandro tiene una discordancia. Dice que la caída de la economía es claramente explicada por la política económica del chavismo. Que el boom petrolero haya maquillado eso no cambia el hecho. Entonces, yo creo que es una perspectiva un poco diferente de la perspectiva que usted presentó a Antonio, y me gustaría saber cómo respondería a esa colocación.
Bueno, directamente es contrafactual señalar como un fracaso la política económica del chavismo, porque hasta 2013 el chavismo podía exhibir números sostenidos de crecimiento económico durante varios años, números sostenidos de distribución de la riqueza durante varios años, el respeto o la promoción de los derechos sociales, de varios derechos sociales de la población como producto de su política económica. Es decir, desde que el chavismo tomó el poder en el 98 y fortaleció el rol del Estado y recuperó, contrario a lo que venía haciendo la política al final del punto fijismo, que era una política privatizadora en materia de política petrolera, recuperó el rol del Estado en la política petrolera, recuperó el rol del OPEP en el mercado internacional, o la presencia del OPEP en el mercado internacional, y los precios a favor de una política nacionalista petrolera, con ese componente nacionalista y con más peso del Estado, se empezaron a ver los impactos positivos en la economía, en materia de crecimiento del PIB, en materia de disminución de la pobreza, de disminución de la desigualdad, es decir, de redistribución de la riqueza. Y esto fue así hasta 2013, ¿no? Entonces no podríamos hablar de una misma política económica. De hecho, es muy claro el giro en la política económica del gobierno de Nicolás Maduro. En los primeros 2-3 años de gobierno hubo una especie de letargo, una especie de inacción en materia de política económica, pero en los últimos 2 años vemos de manera clara un giro liberalizador en su política económica. Entonces no podemos hablar de una misma política económica del chavismo. Repito, esa política económica anterior, con una presencia importante del Estado en la economía, fue una política que fue claramente exitosa, y los números no queda el propio Estado, sino los números de la CEPAL o de organizaciones internacionales así lo demuestran.
Okay, muy bien, gracias. I'm going to go ahead and take a question now from Miguel Francisco. And I think this question is perhaps directed more at Paula and perhaps Diego as well. But of course, anyone is free to jump in. And after I ask the question, I'm going to ask it in Spanish as well. Could the speakers please comment on the failure of the opposition movement to include virtually anyone outside of the upper middle class, which is mostly white? Los ponentes podrían comentar sobre el facto que la oposición no ha incluido casi nadie fuera de las clases medias altas, que es mayoritariamente blanca.
Diego, go ahead.
I will go ahead. So historically, Chavismo presented itself as I'm going to talk in Spanish, Brian, and I'm sorry, I feel more comfortable by speaking in Spanish about this. Racial things are tricky to speak in a foreign language for me. So, gracias por la pregunta. El chavismo irrumpió en el escenario político nacional, sin duda alguna presentándose como aquel que iba a incorporar a las clases más desfavorecidas dentro del proceso político, que iba a reconocer a estas grandes masas, que era la mayoría de la población, en un país con unas profundas desigualdades económicas y sociales, dentro del espacio político. Si bien eso fue cierto en su incepción, en su creación, que fue un movimiento popular que representó el presidente Chávez y que creo que eso es innegable, más allá de que estemos de acuerdo con su estilo, con su respeto a los principios democráticos y con lo que él significa y con la responsabilidad que tiene él de la situación que se vive hoy. Más allá de todo eso, se presentó como ese gran interlocutor con esas grandes masas que habían sido de alguna forma desplazadas de la conversación política por el pacto de punto fijo y la democracia. Este principio es debatible, pero en todo caso es un movimiento, él representó esa popularidad de las masas. Si bien eso es cierto, a medida que ha perdido conexión y capacidad de resolver los problemas mínimos, a la medida en la que se ha dedicado a sistemáticamente violar los derechos humanos, utilizar los recursos del Estado para coercionar a la población, siento que no podemos hablar del madurismo como un movimiento popular y que representa a las clases desfavorecidas y a las minorías raciales o de género. Yo pienso, y parte del trabajo que eso nos despertó en los factores democráticos, eso despertó y llamó la atención de los factores democráticos de hace algunas décadas, y jóvenes como Paola, jóvenes como mi persona, jóvenes estoy seguro que como Antonio, y jóvenes, es decir, en toda Venezuela, tenían un estímulo especial para conectarse, para ir a interactuar, a ir a escuchar, a ir a ayudar, ir a incorporar a esta gente que seguía siendo desfavorecida del proceso político. Entonces, finalmente, para tratar de responder esa pregunta, que es un poco compleja, yo creo que el gobierno interino representa y es un espacio legítimo de participación que es resultado de unas elecciones en las que mayoritariamente el pueblo, ese pueblo más desfavorecido, escogió en las elecciones de 2015, en las elecciones parlamentarias. La mayoría de estas masas populares, de estos factores minoritarios y desfavorecidos, no necesariamente todos de raza blanca, fueron quienes fueron a las urnas y expresaron su deseo de un cambio de rumbo del país, que se representaba y se expresaba en estos candidatos que también vienen de sectores populares, estos candidatos de la oposición que hoy son diputados y diputadas de la República, que muchos de ellos representan no solamente sectores indígenas, sino ahí vemos el rol de la mujer representado de forma importante, la reivindicación de la mujer y el rol de la mujer dentro del proceso político. Así que pienso que es decir, es complicado, es muy fácil, y para mí, que trabajo todos los días en Venezuela, es muy fácil criticar la efectividad del gobierno interino, porque sin duda alguna no ha logrado los objetivos que prometió al electorado y que prometió a sus seguidores, pero hacer política dentro de Venezuela no es un asunto menor. Vivir la persecución política diaria de estos factores más desposeídos de la sociedad, de estos factores que siguen siendo las grandes víctimas de este gran conflicto, no solamente local de dos grupos que se están disputando el poder, sino además son víctimas y están en el medio de este gran conflicto geopolítico. Al final, quienes están pagando las mayores y más profundas consecuencias es la mayoría de la gente que, como conversábamos en el Green Room previo a esta conversación, no están escuchando a la política, ni están escuchando a los políticos, porque están dedicados a simplemente sobrevivir. Yo creo que la clase política en general en Venezuela ha fallado, ha fracasado, y esto es algo que hay que seguir revisando, en poder solucionar estos grandes problemas, estos grandes retos existenciales que hoy vive la mayor cantidad de los venezolanos y que ha generado que más de 5 millones de ellos, de nosotros, hemos tenido que salir por razones económicas o políticas del país.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and take one more question since we are out of time. Paula, if you'd like to respond to the last question or to this question, or to both, that's up to you. But this one's addressed directly to you. So let me go ahead and ask the other one too, and you can answer them both together, perhaps. Victor Enrique Rorato asks to Paula, are the limitations of autocratic forces that you talked about being attempted by the United States appropriate, excessive, or insufficient?
Okay, may I speak in Spanish? That it's better for me?
Sí, claro.
Okay. Bueno, la verdad es que estos son temas realmente complicados que es difícil resumirlos de manera prudente en muy poco tiempo. Entonces, bueno, cualquier comentario, Miguel, Víctor, Olga, que yo haga, pues por supuesto siempre podrá ser ampliado en otros ámbitos, ¿no? Creo que en el tema de las sanciones, yo en lo personal me cuesta mucho hacerme un juicio, ¿no? sobre los efectos, ¿no? Ciertamente los efectos directos esperados de un cambio político inmediato no los hemos vivido, pero también me pregunto en un mundo democrático en donde se plantea colocar al margen cualquier acción militar o de fuerza, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son las otras opciones que tiene Occidente para presionar a las potencias autocráticas? Porque lo que sí es cierto es que existen unas potencias autocráticas que son audaces en los modos en que articulan políticamente en los espacios financieros y en los espacios políticos, y que Occidente pareciera que tiene pocos recursos para actuar. Entonces, cuando me preguntan sobre las sanciones, creo que hay una respuesta que es obvia, y es que no han surtido el efecto inmediato esperado, pero la segunda respuesta me parece que es mucho más complicada y que hay que voltear la mirada hacia los venezolanos que luchan por la democracia y que buscan engranar los esfuerzos, valiosos esfuerzos que se hacen desde quienes han tenido que salir del país porque hay violación de derechos humanos, y eso es muy importante. No podemos perder de vista el informe de la misión de Naciones Unidas que salió en septiembre del año 2020, que investigó más de 3.000 casos y donde se comprueba que hay violación sistemática de derechos humanos. Un gran amigo mío, el concejal Fernando Almán, fue asesinado, fue lanzado del piso 11 del edificio del SEBIN, y luego dijeron que se suicidó al mejor estilo soviético, y a Fernando lo mataron. Y otro gran amigo, que es amigo también de Diego, el diputado Juan Requesens, que estuvo 2 años preso y que tiene unas historias terribles, ¿no? Mientras estuvo preso. Entonces, me parece que el análisis es complejo, que es difícil resumirlo en 10 minutos, y que lo que yo destacaría es que hay un pueblo, unos ciudadanos, que somos nosotros los venezolanos, Diego que está afuera, yo que estoy adentro, y millones que estamos escuchando, que queremos salir, recuperar la democracia, porque somos un pueblo que tenemos ADN democrático, que sabemos lo que es la democracia, que agradecemos el apoyo internacional que se nos puede ofrecer para hacer presiones cívicas para poder salir de la mejor manera negociada y constitucional hacia la democracia, y que condenamos cualquier tipo de injerencia autocrática que por parte de China, Cuba, Irán, Corea del Norte y las distintas fuerzas autocráticas del mundo ocurren actualmente en nuestro país.
Muchas gracias. I know we didn't get to address any questions to Tim yet, and we're pretty much out of time, but Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add to what everyone else has said?
No, I mean, it's been a great conversation in terms of, the U.S. and it's, what they, under Trump, it's rather excessive. I think Antonio spoke to, in terms of the sanctions, already a pretty ravaged economy. Obviously, the damaged oil industry isn't because of the U.S., but the sanctions, certainly exacerbate an already quite difficult situation. So yeah, I mean, I do have hopes that under the Biden administration that some of those sectoral sanctions are rethought, and hopefully the bellicose language of military options on the table. And I don't think we'll see John Bolton around, so perhaps that won't be there. But if the U.S. wants to play any serious role in negotiations, I mean, obviously it has a location in the global political economy, and surely, whatever government Guaido or Maduro is going to want to sell goods. I mean, of course, if it was Guaido, then that wouldn't be an issue. Yeah, I mean, I think the sectoral sanctions are just excessive in the language of the question. And thanks, Brian, and thanks, everyone.
So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Professor Terrasiano now, who will thank our speakers and close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for organizing such an informative panel, and thanks to all the participants. This is such an important discussion for the nation and people of Venezuela. And the problem in the United States is that we really don't have good national news about what is happening in Venezuela and what is really the role of the United States. So we have all learned so much from today's discussion. And I want to say on behalf of the Latin American Institute at UCLA, muchas gracias. Thank you.
Gracias a todos y buenas tardes.